the main thing is that a unified civil society and uncivil society, protesters, are going to have to find ways to leave fossil fuels underground, question the extractivism that impoverishes southern Africa and the Indian Ocean especially, and to demand that the North, including the rich within the southern Africa, especially South Africa, that they pay their ecological debt. Climate reparations is most urgent now, to compensate for loss and damage in the climate severe weather, to pay to have adaptation, to make our coastlines stronger, to have better irrigation systems and stormwater drainage. And third, to compensate Africa for not using fossil fuels. Yeah, there's a war on one coast, which is in Mozambique, Cabo Delgado. It's where the richest gas field, Rovuma Basin, has attracted Total Energies and ExxonMobil and Eni from Italy and the China National Petroleum Corporation and a few others. And what they're trying to do is take gas out. When it's burned, it's 85 times more potent than CO2, and it will warm the Mozambique Channel, the coastline of Mozambique. And when the water goes above 30 degrees, then the cyclones become devastating. Cyclone Idai and Cyclone Kenneth in 2019. And that creates such incredible destruction that the failure to rebuild generates a great deal of grievance. Sometimes the grievance can become Islamic extremism and then be the basis for the blood methane conflict in Cabo Delgado. And South African troops have been put there, asked by Emmanuel Macron from France, with Cyril Ramaphosa, the South African president, agreeing in July 2021. And those troops protect Total and its $20 billion investment in extracting and liquefying the gas, and maybe sending it to South Africa to put into the South African grid. We consider that a sub-imperial gas grab using black South African troops to help the white shareholders of Total. It's absolutely unacceptable. Yeah, the idea of a sub-imperial power, in contrast to the imperialists, which is the United States, the European Union, and the G7, the big, rich Western countries, they're often in alliance through the G20 and through the multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, World Trade Organization, and especially the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So imperialism and the next layer, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, might be the worst, because even though there are rhetorical criticisms of the West, there's never any real battle except for Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine. That's a terrible battle where Putin is clearly seeking his own sub-imperial power, and that means regional expansion. But mostly the sub-imperial powers work on behalf of global capital. And that means, for example, a World Trade Organization that increases the reach of capital. For example, protection of intellectual property rights. Or in the case of the UNFCCC, allows the emissions of CO2 and methane to the level of threatening the planet. And usually the sub-imperialists go along with that because they play a role in their regions where their own companies are using those same tools to extract profits from the region. And then they often play the role, like South Africa does, of the gendarme, the police force for global capital in their region. This idea comes from a Brazilian, Rui Mauro Marini. Marini wrote in the 1960s about Brazil as a sub-imperial power. And the same analysis very much applies today to the BRICS and especially to South Africa in this region. Yes, the Western powers used to be very direct when they would land grab and loot Africa for minerals, for fossil fuels, for land, for agriculture, for plantations, and for bodies. First for slaves, then for migrant workers. Now, many of those systems they've outsourced to the productive powers of the Chinese, the big companies, state-owned companies, and private companies, meaning that not just China, but also India, to some extent Brazil and South Africa, and a tiny bit Russia, they are doing what the Western powers did, but they're doing it even worse. They have even more extractive powers. They often deal even more blatantly with corrupt dictatorial elites in our region. And the profit flows go from these poor African countries to China, and then when China produces things for the West, usually through Western companies having research and development, the profits go to the West, meaning the Chinese are just middlemen, but they are extremely effective and voracious. So we see them in eastern Zimbabwe in diamonds. We see them in South Africa in many mining sectors, as well as automobiles and some steel making. We also see the Chinese in the region where the West has already squeezed out what it can. For example, copper in Zambia, and now the Chinese are moving in and squeezing out even more. And all the time we see the amplification of the Western system by the Chinese. And that also goes for the debt, because the Chinese will finance much of this extraction by putting African countries into high debt. South Africa is a good example with the Transnet debt and the Eskom debt, two of our biggest state companies, those debts to China being absolutely illegitimate. They're full of corrupt deals. So we often find Chinese capital and the Chinese state as the first order enemy of social progress, economic justice, and environmental sanity. And we're hoping we find more Chinese people who are very much against this kind of super exploitation, and that we find ways that we can unite with the oppressed, the Democrats of Hong Kong, or the Tibetans, or the Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and many others, the workers who are protesting, the environmentalists. And so we definitely need to find a BRICS from below, where South Africa's mass movements and the Brazilian and the Indian and the Russian and the Chinese can find themselves together in 2023 for a counter summit against the BRICS.